Hi, everyone. My name is Samir Mallal. I'm the Real Ideas Coordinator at the Toronto Real Asian International Film Festival. I'm an Indian Canadian man with medium length black hair, wearing a gray hoodie, and sitting in an office chair in my apartment's living room. Welcome to Narrative in Other Mediums, the fifth panel in our Real Ideas conference themed Here in the Future Past. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Real Asians offices and main activities are located on the treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat nations. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, a treaty of collective responsibility for the protection and sharing of land and resources. As we continue with a digitally hosted festival that will screen Canada-wide, we encourage audiences to learn the specific histories and stories of the lands they are settled on, the lands of Treaty 11, many treaty agreements, and traditional unceded territories that continue to demand justice and to support the ongoing work of Indigenous leaders and communities. While acknowledging the festival's 25-year history of growth and challenge, we renew and refresh our commitment to more abundance and complexity in Asian and Asian diasporic film and media arts. Regardless of our pathways of arrival, we all currently benefit from the Canadian government's broken treaties and imposed violence and reckon openly with our responsibility to this land and its caretakers. We name the ways we are complicit in structures of white supremacy and also recognize they are still in a time of great upheaval and need. We honor the longstanding work of organizers, creatives, and communities that continue to give us hope, language, and possibility, and work toward critical and reflexive allyship with Indigenous peoples exercising their sovereignty and working toward justice and freedom. For today's panel, we would like to thank the Ontario Cultural Attractions Fund, Ontario Creates, and the province of Ontario for their support. Just a reminder that if you're watching live from our watch portal and want to ask us a question, to send it through the chat or the ask a question box. If you're viewing from a phone, the chat will be at the bottom of the screen. Thank you to Jamie and Joanne, the amazing ASL interpreters in today's session. Thank you, Marianne, our awesome live captioner. Lastly, we would love to hear your feedback on our panels. Please visit realasian.com/RI survey and let us know what you'd like and what you would like to see from us next year. We'll have the QR code posted up at the end of the survey. Each entry enters you in a draw to win a survey prize. We'll take a 5-minute break in the middle of the session so that everyone has a chance to stretch their legs or grab some water. I'll now hand over the rest of the time to the amazing Han, who will be introducing us to the rest of the panelists.
Thanks so much, Samir. Hi, everyone. My name is Han, and welcome to the Toronto Real Asian International Film Festival. I have the honor of hosting today's panel, Narrative in Other Mediums. I'm a product experience designer by day and a design educator on YouTube by night. This panel brings together creatives who work in formats such as film, video games, music videos, commercials, to discuss their experience and expertise with narrative construction and creative direction. Please join me in welcoming my fellow panelists, Sagan, Samir, and Trisha. Hi, folks.
Hello.
Hello, hello.
Hello.
Can I get everybody to do a quick intro about themselves, and then we'll get today's chat started. Maybe Trisha, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Trisha Hegarellis. My pronouns are they, she. I'm a light-skinned Filipina person with long hair doing her best Kurt Cobain impersonation, wearing a sweater on my couch. And I'm based in Toronto. I've been making, I'm a filmmaker, I think, and that's what I'm here as today. I've been making short films since 2015, but I've been working in post-production since about 2008. I've done a bit of short stage work as well as film, and my film work tends to act as sort of fictional, I like to call them fictional archives of my lived experiences as either or and sometimes as a queer Filipina millennial that was born in somewhat assimilationist, raised in Toronto.
Thank you so much, Trisha. Over to you, Samir.
Hey, everybody. My name is Samir Mallal. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a writer, director. I grew up in Ottawa and Vancouver, and then lived in the US for a long time, and now I live in London. So I'm kind of a permanent migrant, I guess. I began my career in documentaries. I made 3 films with the National Film Board, and then I started directing commercials, and that's what I've been spending my time doing for the last 10 years or so. And now I'm, moving into narrative work, and I have a couple of dramatic series of development.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Samir. Over to you, Sagan.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sagan Yee, and my pronouns are they, them. I'm a Chinese-Canadian media artist working in the fields of animation and video games. Originally from Saskatoon, but moved to Toronto for animation school in 2011. From 2016 to 2020, I was the executive director of the Hand-Eye Society, which is a video game arts nonprofit. But some of the recent stuff I've been up to, I'm a 2021 graduate of the Clarion West Workshop for Emerging Speculative Fiction Writers. And the current thing I'm working on is a video game with funding from the Ontario Arts Council. It's about cities and gentrification, kind of aesthetically inspired by the work of NFB animator Richard Condy, who people might know, who did The Big Snit and The Cat Came Back, so like really classic Canadian animated films. And yeah, have done a lot of experimental collaborations with people in the makerspace communities and hardware folks. So maybe if there's time to get into that, we will. But yeah, just a lot of different stuff.
Awesome. I love the diversity of the different mediums in which all of us represent, and kind of, unraveling what makes a good story in all of our respective mediums. I just want to borrow from this year's conference theme, festival theme, which is here in the future past. So it's kind of like a dichotomy where it's here in the future past. I'd love to start from the past. Let's start from the past and kind of dig into, what types of stories did you all grow up with or enjoy reading that perhaps maybe shaped some of the stories that you tell today? Any takers to go first? I'm going to start out. How about you, Sagan? What's a story, types of stories you enjoyed reading, and how did it sort of influence, your storytelling in your medium, which is video games?
So I was a pretty weird kid. I grew up in, prairie suburbia, and I didn't get my I still don't have my driver's license, so I couldn't go anywhere. I spent a lot of time at the public library. So a lot of my influences are like Pokemon was a big one, like anime and manga, but also like random underground comics that I would find in my uncle's room at my grandma's house, or just like a lot of fan fiction, a lot of bargain bin paperback science fiction. I think one of the formative images that I can remember kind of setting me on a path to weirdness is that there was an exhibit on cyborgs in art at the Saskatoon Mendel Art Gallery, and I was like a kid, but there was this clip from David Cronenberg's Videodrome playing on the wall, and it's the scene where the guy is reaching into his own stomach and he like pulls a gun out of his stomach and it's like all fleshy and gross. And I remember just being really fascinated by that. And so yeah, basically anything weird or kind of incomprehensible, a lot of noir and spy fiction, just like pulpy genre stuff, B movies, anything that's kind of trashy or even exploitative in a way. I was always kind of into that stuff. So I don't know if this answer is going to be the same as anyone else's, but yeah, that's kind of where I'm coming from.
That's amazing. And how old were you, Sagan?
Yeah, this would have, I don't remember what age this would have been, like probably like 8 to 15. I remember a lot of brain activity happening when I was 15. Like I was really into just weird stuff on the internet and writing fanfics and posting them for strangers to comment on and stuff like that. So that's kind of like, I consider that sort of my cultural background. A lot of geeky fandom stuff.
That's awesome. How about
and
you,
things
Samir?
I shouldn't have been watching.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great story. So I grew up in Ottawa, which I think I'm a little bit older than everybody else on this panel, but I'm not really a millennial. I'm sorry. No, so I grew up in Ottawa, and at the time it was like pretty, let's say, white in terms of like the dominant culture, and like my school, like I was one of the only people of color. And so I kind of like used TV and like big movies as a kind of escape, because I didn't really, want to watch like Bollywood movies, and I kind of rejected my Indianness as a kid. And I was more into like really big, big movies like Star Wars and stuff like that. I didn't get exposed to sort of, more independent stuff or even documentary things like that till later. But I always wanted to like tell stories like from a very early age. And I used to make a lot of music as well. And I think that for me was like an early form of storytelling. And I think I was really drawn to like, American Black culture. I feel like I kind of like related to that. And my father was really into jazz, really into, singers like Marvin Gaye and that kind of stuff. So I always had this kind of romantic relationship with Black culture, American Black culture specifically. And I think that sort of influenced me to a degree of just being trying to be like an insider and outsider and tell stories, and I think that has definitely had a huge influence on my work.
I love that. I love that you mentioned stories as sort of your ticket into sort of like the mainstream culture, but then the rejection of certain stories also shaped sort of your identity, right? So it's like sort of the acceptance, like using the storytelling medium as this sort of like cultural ticket in and out of certain identities. So I love that. How about you?
Yeah.
I love that. I love that.
So I was saying earlier how my parents would watch anything and everything, and like VHS, like renting movies was an activity. That's what we did every weekend. And I guess I grew up in Toronto. I grew up in like Thorncliffe, Flemington area, so fairly like, multicultural neighborhoods. And there's like around the area we could get movies. We could get like the blockbusters, or we could get like a number of like Filipino movies, and like also like action movies, like Hong Kong action films, which I inevitably like just grew to love, because that's what I was being fed, I guess. But I think when I started to like, I remember being 12 or something, or maybe 10, and just remembering the summer of movies and like recording all the things. So it was like a mix of like A League of Their Own had come out, and that was like huge. I like for the longest time wanted to be a baseball player. But then I guess it was sort of like I started developing my own taste, and kind of like Sagan, I like anime was like Sailor Moon had just come out, and so it was super influential. Like it was just like I just couldn't get enough, and then it was like somewhat easy to get a hold of like fan subs, like anime fan subs, and so I kind of just grew like, you know, became used to like watching. Like it kind of reignited an interest in like Asian cinema specifically, just because I guess the act of reading subtitles was true. I was just very much like, oh my god, I could just read this, and it's like a whole level, like a whole new level of things to watch. And I think I remember, so yeah, it was kind of yeah, a lot of anime, but also a lot of action films, a lot of sci-fi things, a, a lot of like really bad Filipino comedy films I just really enjoyed because they made my parents laugh so much, and I didn't get it, but it was nice to see them laugh like that. But yeah, and I guess I don't know, I guess like, you know, along with anime, it was just whatever fed my like I was an angsty young like adult, like you know, I was an angsty kid and an angsty teenager, so whatever like things looked dark, like for me that was like the Addams Family, but eventually it would just, you know, grow to be things like Aeon Flux, I guess, like things that were geared towards, I guess, Gen Xers, Gen X adults, I kind of really enjoyed. And then I guess I had in Toronto, well, I guess in Canada, we had the Showcase review with, and it just sort of, yeah, it just introduced me to like world cinema, I guess, and independent cinema, and I kind of fell in love with like Asian cinema specifically again, but through like my own filtering, like without my parents having to like select the movies for me.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I love that. I feel like I'm hearing through everyone's story this thread of like connection through stories, right? Like finding connection either to yourself or to other people, or, you know, like this is the sense of intrigue. I'm just wondering, does anybody have like a powerful story from their childhood, either experienced or heard, or otherwise that has kind of stuck with you and you feel like has been, you know, kind of in your mind as you're creating, you know, in your careers now?
I feel like what I just described sort of, it has a very collage or kaleidoscopic feeling for me. So it's really hard for me to pick one thing that has stuck with me through the years, because it really was just a bunch of random stuff that I was dumping into my head. Like I would, you know, I'll dig through bargain bin containers at the comic book store just to, like, you know, find some image or some phrase or something that I could add to the pile. It's like a raven that sees something shiny and just like kind of collects it and then stores it away for later. So yeah, just like impressions of growing up kind of trapped in a suburban cul-de-sac where you know, there's nothing interesting within walking distance except for a strip mall with a Dairy Queen and a Blockbuster, and now the Blockbuster isn't there anymore. So just what but then, you know, the internet was kind of there for me during those times where I was stuck indoors in the cold Saskatoon nights. So yeah, just like a lot of fond experiences of staying up until 4 a.m. talking with people that I would never meet in person and just like finding community there, I think was kind of the biggest influence on me.
Awesome. So I'm hearing it's for you, it was more of like a collection of multiple stories and just, I guess, breaking out from what sounds to be like a brown, kind of like a ticky-tacky life in Saskatoon, and just kind of like immersing yourself into different types of story just to really, escape. It's almost a form of escapism.
Yeah, I think we'll probably get into it later, but I think what it impressed upon me was the idea of stories as not just being a thing that one person does, like just in a linear way. It's also the community that forms around that, those stories, and the sort of culture that that builds up around those sorts of things. And I think I mentioned this before, but like I'm third generation Canadian, so my parents were both born in Canada, and they don't have like a huge connection culturally or language wise to China. So I don't know any Chinese, and like, there was kind of like the trappings of Chinese culture around our house. Like we did the whole red envelope thing for gifts and that sort of thing. But I never felt super strongly for it. But then again, I didn't feel like I was a white person either. I felt like sort of in between worlds. So I was like, well, I don't feel connected to a culture. I will kind of make my own on the internet because there's a lot of outsiders and in between people there who are just kind of trying to find their way. So that was kind of where I think I come from.
Gotcha. How about anybody else? Any powerful stories from childhood that's kind of stuck with you, or influence your narratives and the stories that you tell now?
I mean, the thing about stories, and like I think why we tell stories is to kind of like make sense of things that we don't totally understand. I think it just innately, or we're trying to understand probably more accurately. So I feel like a lot of the things that maybe have stuck with me, a lot of things that maybe stuck with me are like traumas, right? Those are the things that I personally remember more. But I think that like those things can also be empowering, and I think what I've found is like there's it's more about like a point of view, I feel like that I ended up sort of getting, which I was kind of hinting at earlier, but just sort of feeling like kind of a double outsider. So like I would grow up in this kind of white milieu. My parents were Indian, but very like liberal by any standards, really. And they they were professionals, but they always both wanted to be artists, but they weren't really allowed to. So they really encouraged my creativity, which, as we know, in any Asian culture, I'm going to make a broad statement here, but generally it's not necessarily encouraged. I'm certainly the only like creative person in my family, one of the few that's actually made a career out of it. So and they were immigrants as well, and there's a lot of pressure to succeed generally, right? And so or whatever success means in that context. But I think that I will say, not speaking the language. So for instance, like I developed like my my like lust for wanting to create, and my imagination, through like being in the car, and my parents are speaking Hindi. I don't understand what they're saying. I'm sitting next to my sister, and she probably doesn't want to talk to me. My big sister, like she wants to listen to her Walkman, and I'm looking out the window kind of in my own world, and at school I kind of felt like that as well. And so it ends up sort of, you kind of develop this muscle of imagination, right? And this is like when we didn't have phones and we didn't have the internet, we weren't constantly like stimulated by some external machine, right? And this kind of idea that we can sort of connect to anything. So you kind of had to like find that within yourself. And I think that perspective has really shaped my work, in everything I do, of sort of just wanting to drop into a place and kind of feel at home, but not feel too, not feel long enough to sort of get sick of it or feel too sort of too much like a citizen of anywhere, you know. And I think, and I'm grateful for that, you know. So yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. It feels like, I mean, we're talking about narratives and other mediums, but it feels like it's almost, it's at our stories come from intersection of so many different identities, right? That we're kind of like all balancing, and out from that is this output of these stories that we tell. And so I was just, recently at a workshop, a storytelling workshop with Matthew Dix. I believe he has a book about story writing. He says, you know, tell stories from wounds. From scars, not wounds. So tell stories from a place that has been healed and not from a place that is still open, because then things are raw and then your audience feels very uncomfortable, right? Because it's like, ooh, that person is still going through it, versus this person has healed from it, this person has learned from it. And then now they can tell the story where, you know, you can actually feel like there's that arc at the end, right? That hero arc. This person has redeemed themselves. This person has achieved something. So yeah, I'm really hearing that in your stories, Samir. Thanks for sharing. Now maybe let's kind of like move over to the present a little bit. I know we've kind of like talked about the past and maybe like how everyone has gathered ingredients for their storytelling. And now it's like, hey, what are your recipes? What are your recipes for a good story? This is going to be super interesting because again, everyone works in a different medium. But I'd love to hear from you, Trisha. What are the ingredients for your great stories? I watched your film. It was amazing.
Oh, thank you. I'm kind of in a strange, I feel like I'm changing, which I know we're gonna talk about, but I think initially when I started writing, before I finally made a film, it was always about the character. It was usually kind of, it always started with a character doing something. So it was an image of this character. For me specifically, I write from I guess a point of disconnection and characters wanting to connect in a sense. And then I would just sort of like write that until something of an interest, and then like fit it. And as I was learning sort of filmmaking, as I was learning how to write for film, it would always be like, this is the character, these are some scenes, and then how would it fit into like a 3-act structure or a 5-act structure? And then once you have that down, mess that structure up, just fuck it up a little bit. But I think for me, like, you know, at this point right now, what I think I try to focus on is sort of like, who is this person? What do you want to say? How does that person change? And what is the emotional journey? I think a good, like, you know, I think a story always has to have an emotional journey and a change for the main character, which, I mean, I think it sounds a little like maybe that's a bunch of like structure books like distilled into like these 5 sectors, but into those 5 points. But I feel like it's always the truest part, and I think when it gets hard to write, it's kind of, those are the things you must have, in a sense.
Yeah. How about you, Sagan? Is it the same when you're kind of working in your medium?
So yeah, there's a couple different mediums that I like to work in, and they're all kind of different flavors. I have different processes for each of them. Sometimes it's different even within the medium. So I have a different process for short stories than I do for novels, for example. And it's not like I'm a published author or anything, but I have written like novel length things that may or may not see the light of day, but I know what I like about them, and that's kind of what matters. So I think the ingredients to a good story, I think my primary concern is there a confident voice? And that's like in terms of, if there's a story that someone else has done, what do I like in other people's stories? It's usually the voice. So they can break all the rules as far as I'm concerned. There's no limits to what anyone can do. and often some of the things that I like about a particular story is the fact that they don't conform to any sort of rule, or they are subverting a structure in some way. Like, you know, there are movies I watch where, you know, nobody learns anything. Like they sort of go on a journey, but like, you know, was there a theme? Was there a point to any of this? I don't know. It's kind of rambly, but it's just something about it, just something about the visuals. My friend Peter Kaplowski, who does the curation for Midnight Madness at TIFF, also runs a film festival called What the Film Festival, and it's like sort of all the weird stuff that like was too weird for Midnight Madness and like really doesn't fit into anywhere, and those are some of like the best movies that I've ever seen. And so like that stuff is really inspiring to me. Like it would be my dream to pull off a work that, you know, 99% of audiences are going to be like, I do not understand this. And I mean, you know, the first person that I'm doing it for is myself. And then if that other 1% of the audience enjoys it, then that's like the sweet spot for me. Yeah, so like, yeah, developing the voice and kind of getting at the truth of just that, the feeling that I had when I first came up with the idea, trying to preserve that is important to me, and sometimes that can be a real challenge.
Awesome. And how about you, Samir? I know you do some commercial work. Can you sort of, what Trisha says, like fuck up the arc a little bit, just like have all the ingredients and kind of mix them up? Or are there challenges to that when you are, you know, kind of doing this more of like commercial work?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, in commercials, that, you know, we want to tell stories, but we're also like talking about something for a brand, right? Whether that's like, hey, go out and buy this thing, or whether that's, hey, look at us, you know, pay attention to us, or whether that's, hey, we're this now, we're not that anymore, you know. So you've got, you know, I would say in commercials, like you have multiple authors, right? And as the director of a commercial, you know, you've got the agency, you've got the client, you've got your production company. You're kind of like navigating all these people with sometimes, you know, the same interests and sometimes competing interests, right? And then out of that, you're meant to tell a story. You know, I have a slightly different point of view about stories than Sagan. I think that for me, like a story, like to be called a story, you know, there needs to be certain things. Personally, I think that like stories like span different mediums, right? Like a painting can be a story, or, you know, a song can be a story, and songs are stories in my mind. But I think you do need certain things, like there needs to be some kind of meaning in there needs to be a relationship between the form and something you're trying to say. That I think is a critical part of the story. You know, I think that there needs to be some form of change, whether that's, you know, a protagonist realizing that, you know, whatever, there's no place like home, or whatever it is. But there needs to be some, yeah, I think some kind of change, because I think like there is, you know, the reason why stories tend to be structured in certain ways, it's not just random. It has to do with how our brains are structured, right? It has to do with how we tell stories to ourselves all day, right? All day we're talking to ourselves, going, oh, this, that. You've got this inner monologue going about yourself, which is not reality. It's a story based on your experience, whatever your past experience was, your past trauma, and your genes, and also, you know, other factors like what you ate that day, right? So I think that like those things, like structure, they come from deeper places, and I find it really fascinating. You know, we could talk about that all day, but there is an amazing book if you're interested in the relationship between biology and physiology and story structure. There's a book called The Science of Storytelling by a guy named Will Storr, novelist who studied the brain, and it's fascinating when you look at the relationship there.
Mm-hmm. No, I totally hear you. I think, yeah, very much. I think our realities are stories, right? That we tell ourselves, that are chiseled from our experiences, from our traumas, from, I think, our genes. That's where generational trauma comes from, right? It's passed down, and that kind of gives you a lens in which you see the world, and then tell stories based on that. So I totally hear you. If you can just repeat the title of the book, maybe someone in the from the conference here can kind of share it over.
I'm going to put it in the chat. Science of Storytelling, Will Storr.
Perfect. Yeah, we actually have a question from the audience. I think you just mentioned, Samir, is the story needs to sort of have some sort of change, and I think Trisha mentioned this too. Do you think stories need endings that like end on notes of hope? Like, does it need to?
Oh no, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I mean, generally speaking, the best stories, if you go back to, so Aristotle wrote the what's called the Poetics, right, which is this sort of foundational book about storytelling, written in I think 500 BC, something like that, which is still very much how we create stories today. So the word protagonist comes from that, right? Antagonist, all these ideas come from this one thing. So he talks about, the greatest ending to a story in a tragedy has irony, which means it's bittersweet, which means the character gets what they want, but they also lost something of great value to them, right? So, Oedipus finds the killer. So, just to go back to, Greek, the most famous Greek play is Oedipus Rex by Sophocles. So he, the goal of Oedipus in that story, the sort of external goal, is he wants to find the killer. So he finds the killer. Spoiler alert: he is the killer himself. It's within him, right? So he learns about himself. He learns about his true self, but in the end, he's sort of left to he becomes blind because he blinds himself basically after discovering this terrible thing about himself, and he's kind of left to live with the knowledge of all of the bad, like the horrific things that he's done, that he was originally trying to stop in order to save everyone. And so that's a bittersweet ending which has irony, right? And those are the most powerful, in my opinion, stories.
Yeah. Does it have to do, and this is, I think, a question for the entire panel, does it satisfy the human brain? Does this human brain need a story that is equal in terms of all of the emotions in it? Does it need to be, it can't just be filled with just, pure happy hope, and it needs to have a little bit of sorrow, a little bit of like, does it need that mix just to satisfy like that just feeling in our brain of like, hey, the world, this equilibrium that we try to kind of keep?
I think it depends like on the character. I think it depends on what you're watching. Like I think like if you take it to film, like okay, like I just rewatched The Shining, like you don't really, that ending, which is not as hopeful as the book, let's say, is like an appropriate ending for that character, I think, for that portrayal of Jack. But I think, I think it depends on who's telling the story. I think as like a queer filmmaker, I think, for so long, films were made about queer characters, but like in terms of punishment of them, right? And they're often made by like non-queer filmmakers, like, and so for the longest time you had queer characters that died, like just were killed left, right, and center as like, I don't know if anyone knows about the Hays Code or anything like that in Hollywood cinema, where you could be gay or you could be a queer woman, but you had to die at the end. You had to be punished for doing it, kind of thing. So I think it depends on the time. I think it depends on, what you're trying to say, and like, and on a technical level, it does depend on like whether, like, again, that emotional journey, that character's journey, I think, as to whether they should. But if it is, if you're taking it through tropes, I think in a case like that, I think then it should be questioned. Whether it satisfies somebody's like, I don't know, if it's for someone's satisfaction, I guess, who's watching, like as a queer woman watching a tragic ending, it's not satisfying. But some people like who don't care about that might argue against that. But so I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like if you're talking about ingredients, it's almost like, you are kind of making a meal for someone, but there's no set of ingredients that's going to satisfy everyone, nor is there someone who is, like, most people aren't content to eat the exact same meal 3 times a day, like for the rest of their life. So like everything needs to be changed up at some point. Well, maybe there's some people who do eat the same things over and over again, like Marvel movies. They could be happy just like eating that for the rest of their life. Am I making a meal for them? No. And I am not that person, but that's fine.
Yeah, and I think, Trisha, you mentioned something that I thought was super interesting, especially as we are part of, the Asian diaspora, is this idea of intersectionality, right? Like all of us bring to the table multiple identities. I am a first generation immigrant, grew up here, so I'm kind of like in this in between, but I'm also small in stature, and so I think there's a bunch of these identities that we kind of bring to our stories. And so I'm just wondering, like, how do you keep authentic to your own story, standing where you are at your intersection? And is that important to you in bringing to your craft? Anybody can go.
Yeah, I guess I'll answer that. For me, it's like, it's almost center to my work, whatever authenticity. It's like, I think, for me, it's always writing from some of, and I think in that case, I know that it's like, it happened to me, and I think that's like, it's like validation in a sense. I whatever authentic is, to be honest, is like, as someone who grew up in the Filipino diaspora, but as is the second gen who doesn't speak any Philippine dialect and things like that. It's just sort of the idea of authenticity is always sort of plagued me. It's just sort of like, can I make a Filipino movie? Can I, like, who am I to do that kind of thing? And so I think for me, like, I think that's why so far my work has been so grounded in experiences. I mean, like with a fantastical flair, obviously, like with something like my stuff is like very genre based and things like that. But it's like, I think even then, I guess what I like ways to keep it authentic is just to be like, okay, this is a story that I'm telling essentially about myself, even though it's not specifically about myself, and just sort of, staying that line and hoping it sort of has a sort of it's like a signal, I guess. It's like I make the work as true to myself as possible, and just hope that someone gets that ping, just somebody else can relate to it somehow. Yeah.
And do you think the identity piece, so you talked about, how can I make a Filipino movie? Who am I? Like, is it because do you self-identify as like, a Filipina, but is it just because you'd rather share in your craft like actual experiences? Is it like part of your identity to
I think it's part of an identity crisis. I've like probably, will struggle with the rest of my life, kind of thing. I think, yeah, I'm sorry, the question was like, is it, oh, like, why is it my own experiences? I think it's also like my own experiences because I mean, filmmaking is a craft that I don't always get to. It's not like I'm not a full-time director right now. So it's like, I think it's a matter, it's partly practicing a craft in a sense. And I think that's kind of, and I think as Samir said earlier, it's like, it's kind of like, you do the work to investigate, you do the work to like work through things, your traumas and things like that. And so I think that's why so far, except for this last film that just played it, Inside Out, which was about somebody else, that it sorry, as part of Real Asians thing, it's my work prior to that was yeah, it's what I drew from, essentially, to work through whatever I needed to work through.
Yeah. How about you, Samir? Like, do you find authenticity is important to your work, and how do you bring that, if it is, how do you bring that to your stories?
Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, I definitely, I've been trying to, well, I've been, writing for a while now. And I found myself attracted to certain stories that weren't really authentic to me. And then as soon as I shifted into something more personal, it was a different kind of storytelling. So I think that, yeah, I think to really properly tell a story about something, I don't think it needs to be about you, but I think you kind of need to be able to inhabit whatever it is that's going on with your character, and be able to, at the very least, take their experience and sort of project your version of that experience into a dramatic situation. And so I think it's very important that it feels authentic to like how people really are. I think the reason that's important is because, depending on the tone of the story as well, but even like a Tarantino, for instance, it still feels really authentic. You don't know if that's actually how it is, but it still feels super authentic. Like, if I watch Pulp Fiction, I'm like, oh, this is what LA must have been like in the mid 90s, but I have no idea if that's true or not, right? It's just, but the way he draws his characters, even though it's totally not plausible, it doesn't really matter, because there is this layer of authenticity there, right? So, but I think that, like, we've sort of gone, there's such a reaction now to sort of everybody telling, like, okay, I'm Indian Canadian, so I'm going to tell my Indian Canadian story, and so I feel like just speaking about Tarantino again, his, because people have called him out a lot, obviously, for certain things, and which I think we all know what those are, and it's sort of like, well, it's his defense, like, look, I'm a storyteller, I should be able to tell a story about anything. I kind of subscribe to that as well, but we've also been kind of traumatized by one-dimensional portrayals. So I think that it really depends on, the motive and the desire, and the author, and what they're willing to do, how much they're willing to put of themselves into any story. But from my perspective, as long as you're willing to be authentic and put the work in to be authentic, and put yourself on the line, then I think, anybody should have the right to sort of tell what story they want, personally.
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge, even if you're ostensibly telling a story about someone else or another group of people that is not, you know, from your own background. It's still your story. Like you're still filtering it through yourself. So like, you know, what do you mean by the word authenticity? I think is important to reflect on, because you're working in a medium that is, if you're telling a story, it is by its very nature fictional. So there's a word that one of my old animation profs at Sheridan used a lot, which was verisimilitude, which means you're like truth likeness. You're trying to convey truth through something that resembles but is not in itself reality. So you're trying to get people to buy into this alternate dimension of the imagination, and so acknowledging that that is the case, that there's like a power and a responsibility there, I think is what we mean when we ask these questions, and not being like, you know, is this an objective representation of reality? It can never be that. And like, if there's one common thread in all of the things that I've ever heard Indigenous people say about stories and storytelling and appropriation and that sort of thing, is like the importance of plurality. So you can't just, you know, oh, I want to tell a story about XYZ culture. I'll go to talk to like one or two people from that group, and then that's like the entire experience. It's like, I got a sensitivity reader. They said it was okay. It's like, you can't really stop there, but nor is it realistic to expect that you can survey every single person in that community and somehow aggregate that data into something resembling a totally authentic narrative. People like to talk about stories being universal, and when, you know, in my opinion, they're actually very narrow, almost by definition, even if they touch lots of people's lives. So there's like there's a lot of thorniness and paradoxical things about storytelling that I think are important to acknowledge and be transparent about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's, you touched on something that it's been kind of in my mind throughout this entire talk, is, you know, we talk about storytelling, but it's really just a narrative, right? It's one part of it. It's not the whole story. The whole story sometimes can be tough to tell because there are so many perspectives to kind of take in. And, you know, when you are telling a story, you really are trying to focus in on that one thing. And so trying to tell all the stories of a group or a culture is really tough. And so glad we kind of like took that down a little bit in terms of like, what is authenticity? And I think what I'm hearing echo throughout this entire talk is authenticity is really just like you kind of being true to yourself. It's almost like it's a personal relationship rather than like this blanket term that we can apply to, I mean, any type of storytelling. So yeah, awesome. I think we are at time for a break. Is this the time we're going for a break now, Samir? Welcome back, everybody. Let's start off with this second portion with a question. We have a question from the audience, and they are wondering, what tips do you have for writing dialogue or stories that feel real? So I think before the break, we were talking about authenticity and, you know, how it's, I think, almost like a very, it's a term that can mean so many things, but real, what does real mean to you? And how do you have tips for writing stories that feel real? So I guess maybe the first question is, you know, what's real to you, and how do you write stories or dialogues that feel real? Any takers?
I think dialogue, kind of like Sagan brought up a word that I hadn't heard since university, verisimilitude, where it is like, as long as it's true to the world that you're building, and it has to tell you something about it, I think it has to set the tone of, you know, the tone, like the feel of the piece in a sense, and information obviously, but also I think the dynamics between characters. I think that also tells a lot. Like I think like Squid Game, if you know like some of the titles that they use in that language, it really takes the story to another level, especially the Marvel episode. But yeah, as an example, but that for me is like dialogue can be whatever it is. It can sound as like bad as it is as long as it's your world and that's what you're trying to say. And also the information about who is who in relation to who's talking, and things like that.
Yeah, I think I mean, writing good dialogue is difficult. It's something I definitely struggle with.
Lots of
I
nods.
mean, but yeah, it really is. It takes a lot of work, I think, because first of all, I mean, dialogue is not like a conversation you have in real life. Like that's not what dialogue in a story is, right? So, but at the same time, it does need to sound true to that character. And in a good story, any good story, each character, each main character has a voice, right? Like they have a specific way of speaking, just like in real life. And there's a musicality or whatever to that. There's a certain rhythm or tempo or pitch or whatever, right? And in stories, generally, you want to treat it like you want to have contrast, just like in a song, right? So you want to have like the melody, right? And then you want to have the rhythm, and then you want to have like the backbone, right? And so you kind of can just kind of see it musically, and you want to kind of like a scene that's rich and well written. It kind of has like these different layers. So like John Truby, who's written one of these screenwriting groups, called it Symphonic Dialogue, right? Where the top layer might be just, okay, here's what I want and here's what I'm trying to get from you, right? Most scenes are kind of a negotiation, right, between two people or multiple people or two points of view. But then there's like a deeper layer, which is, what are you not saying that you're trying to get or what you want, right? So it's that internal dialogue that can kind of come out. And then there's should be in a lot of scenes a kind of a progression. So it's sort of like, it's a dialectic, right? It's there's a thesis, and then there's an antithesis, and then there's a kind of a new synthesis, right? So it's like, and your dialogue kind of has to do that a lot of the time, right? It has to kind of produce that a lot of the time in order for it to feel like your story is moving forward and that there's a point in the scene. So yeah, there's a long-winded way of saying, here's what I do. Okay, I record conversations illicitly. Like I just did that recently. I was hanging out with all my relatives. Like one of them was like having a meltdown and like going crazy, and I was like, oh, this is good material, and so I took out my iPhone. I'm just like, everybody's got a professional like recording setup. Yeah, I'm not going to do anything with it. I'll never publicize it or anything, but it's just to hear like how people talk, right? And then I write stuff down all the time, like so and so said this, so and so said that, zingers, one-liners, whatever. And I have like a collection of those, because then you can, when you're writing, you can kind of go and like reference that, right? Then there's also like, iambic pentameter, like Shakespeare's written in da, 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 da. I'm not saying like every line of dialogue has to be like that, but when you go through your dialogue, you can say it out loud, right? And then you'll hear it differently, or record yourself reading the lines, and you can start to see, oh, like this rhythm is kind of off, or there's filler words. I don't need this extra word, right? Because stories are about taking away, compressing real life into like a kind of like nuclear reactor, right? So you need to get rid of like all the extra stuff that's not kind of right, those sorts of things, unless you want that for the character. So I do that, when I'm reading, just kind of like try to get a sense of the rhythm. I do readings, so I'll like force my friends to like read my stuff, or just so I can hear how they're talking. And then, if you know actors, get an actor to like read your script and just tell them, hey, like forget about the script, do the scene without the script and see what they do. And then you can like take some of those ideas that they bring, because then you'll see, oh, that's kind of awkward for somebody to actually say. So if you've got friends who are actors, I would just get it on his feet, like stop, stop just like sitting there writing, like stand up, walk around, do something and say your lines, see how that changes it.
Yeah, so I'm hearing dialogue is a lot about what is said, but also what is not said, and then giving it a life, right? So trying to take from life, like dialogue of life. You're talking about filming. I don't know if everyone wants to film their family if they're as spirited as yours, but also, kind of injecting.
Yeah, that might not be legal. It might not be legal, but I mean, whatever.
Yeah, and injecting
in some
life.
states.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Injecting life into your writing by giving it life, asking someone to talk, to say it, to do some motion, and then come and read it again to see if in actual what it is being read out loud, does it have that same feeling and emotion that you still feel on screen. I just want to go back to that little moment when Samir said dialogue writing is very hard, and everyone was like vigorously shaking their head. Yes, yes, yes. I'll throw this over to Sagan. What are some of your challenges with dialogue, especially in your medium, various mediums?
Yeah, I don't know why it's so difficult to write dialogue when it's literally something everyone does. Like, I know how to talk, I know how to have conversations. Why is it impossible to put this down in any way, shape, or form? But I think, to my co-panelists' points, there's kind of two ways you can go about it. You can do what Trisha did and make a silent film. Like, literally just avoid the problem, play to your strengths. If you pick up, there's plenty of films and video games and movies that don't actually have a lot of dialogue. Like, if you sit down and watch them, they're still compelling. And especially if you're working in a visual medium, or a book where you can go into the internal aspects of a character, you can actually elide a lot of dialogue altogether, and a lot of great artists do, if you actually sort of look at how the volume of how much dialogue is in the thing. But yeah, but I also will write down funny things that I hear people say when I'm out and about, which I was very sad the pandemic sort of robbed me of the ability to do that. But I remember being stuck on for 2 hours in LA, and just this guy behind me was talking on his phone the whole 2 hours, and I was just writing down the rhythms of just amazing rhythms in some of these big American cities. And so it's kind of a weird thing where you're like, oh, how did these Hollywood writers, how do they get those tones and those rhythms and stuff like that? It's that's just how people there talk. It's very different than suburban Saskatoon, where everyone's in their there's nobody around to hear them talk like that. So this kind of goes into being maybe a little bit in love with the American rhythms of things rather than what's in front of your face. So but observation is a big part of it. Yeah, and in video games, I find, I don't know if you want me to segue into the question that was specifically for me about getting more into video game stuff.
Yeah.
And the plotlessness of video games, but video game dialogue has historically been really bad, to the point where people still make fun of it, and to the point where it's actually part of the historical culture of the medium, is to have these all your base are belong to me, that were translated from the Japanese into English and into something other language and then back to English, it sounds so very stilted and abstract. And that's actually become sort of part of the fun of making video games, is you can have characters talk in this extremely unrealistic, bizarre way, but people who have played a lot of video games and grew up with that kind of style actually understand it as being, you know, part of the medium in a weird way, rather than like something we can just point and make fun at. And now it's like a stylistic choice. It's like another color in your palette that you can use to work with. But that was only possible because we have several generations of people who grew up playing this stuff now. So in terms of the plotlessness, okay, so specific examples, the game I'm working on right now, the one about cities and gentrification, the additional dimension that you're working with when it comes to games is the mechanics of the world. So it's more about like, yeah, building a structure and a world and an environment. A lot of stuff can come from that rather than a plot. So you can create a world for someone to walk around in and discover things, and it's not linear, and there might not even be like a climax per se in the way that you would traditionally understand it. So in this game that I'm making, what I have in my head is a structure by which you're in this like sort of like a weird version of, I kind of wanted like a Looney Tunes version of Toronto. So I'm going to be drawing all the assets myself, and all, you know, the buildings might have faces on them, and maybe the buildings talk to you about, you know, what's inside of them or what used to be inside of them. And I wanted to sort of capture, because I moved to Toronto in 2011, and it's been through a lot in that time. And so just capturing the feeling of being somewhere and just watching it change over a very short period of time. So you're in the city and you kind of have a grocery list, but every time you go into a building and come back out, the city changes. So there's like the number of Starbucks or whatever equivalent that I eventually come up with increases, and there's just like, you know, glitchy, there's like cranes, like literal cranes, like the bird cranes, like moving things around and changing things. Yeah, exactly. Like, so now I have to like revisit what I'm actually gonna put as this sort of infestation of gentrification. Weed shops and bubble tea stores, I think I'm gonna settle on. And then sort of, and then like the third time you come back out, it's like, you know, there's like maybe two types of buildings, and then the Rom crystal is like slowly encroaching over the city. Like it's going to completely consume everything. So that's like, is that a plot? There's definitely a structure there and a progression of some kind, but there isn't really you the player are kind of an empty vessel, and that's common in a lot of games where I don't intend to sort of give the player character a backstory. It's you're the character that's in the story, so whatever you're bringing to the table and how you feel about the situation, that's, you know, that's what's happening. And I could go on more about that, but maybe I'll, if anyone else wants to jump in, or we can move to another topic.
Anybody want to chime in? I maybe on the like the topic of like I don't know, just observed is like observations, right? It's just like you're experiencing Toronto in this different way. Now you're incorporating into this world building. I'm curious for everyone else too is you know, types of stories, and I feel like types of stories that might be missing from current media, or things that you feel like, I mean, I think all of us have a very unique story to tell, so it's like your story is missing, but what types of maybe themes or genres? I think there's a lot more talk and a lot more progression in terms of representation in stories, at least now. I'm experiencing it a lot more now rather than in my childhood. Curious your experience, and you know, how you expect things to kind of change.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in here quickly. I think like Riz Ahmed has this term called the necklace, which you guys can read this article he wrote, but basically he talks about sort of like 3 stages of representation with you know, cultural communities or subcultural communities. So the first one is when, you know, the story is, the conflict, the drama comes from something to do with their, conflicted identity. I think the second one is like a kind of a middle phase where there's still that element, but it's not the primary sort of like central drama of the story. So for instance, like Bend It Like Beckham, it's all about this culture clash, right? But if you look at, say, Sound of Metal, the fact that like Riz is Pakistani Brit, like it has nothing to do with the narrative whatsoever, right? He's just a character, he's just a guy. Or Nightcrawler, or Night Of, there was still a bit of that. So I think going towards that third level where, yeah, there's no reason why you can't have a main character who's a hero, like Green Knight, right? Dev Patel, it's like an Indian British guy playing, a knight in like the time of King Arthur. I mean, it's, so that's what I'm really excited about, is like that's where things are going. I mean, there's still that pull, backwards to a degree, or not, I won't say backwards, but just like, I see it in advertising, where I get called now because I'm one of the few, brown directors in advertising. And so I get the call if there's something, to do with like Indian stuff. But I think moving away from that completely and having, the experience that we have, which is maybe seeing that stuff, but from our perspective as second generation, if it is there at all, that's what kind of excites me,
What about you?
I want to see a cop show with, the detective, the lead is an Asian guy or a woman or whatever, I just, and have that just be that's it, yeah.
I'm excited about, I'll start with the things that I'm excited about. I'm excited that, actors like like to Samir's point, like the fact that Dev Patel started on like the unpopular one from Skins and now is like the very sexy person on the Green Knight. I think that's incredible. That's really exciting to watch. I am excited for like, I guess, like films by diasporic filmmakers, like Islands. I'm excited to watch, and like things like Minari was very exciting to me. Movies also, and then also like, in terms of queer cinema, like things like this is a few years old, but like things like Pariah was very exciting to me when it came out by Dee Reese, because it was something, they're like personal stories, but then they're universal, but they add to like the lexicon of film. Like I think when Sagan was talking about like the bad dialogue, but how there was generations before us to like, put that there to make it mainstream. Like I'm excited that it's happening now. I'm excited that you can tell like like stories about like our like Filipino and Filipino uncles in Toronto, and then kind of make it kind of like lets you, it kind of like makes space to be like, to make things that aren't about like your culture, in a sense. It's sort of like it sort of allows for it like allows you to like either like for anyone to play any character, but also to like tell like the even smaller stories, I think. Like very specific, like almost specific stories, which I think like like queer cinema, for example, for when I like in the early 2000s or like the 90s, like everything was about coming out. Like everything was a coming out story, and it wasn't until like I don't know, last year or something like that, where it became less and less about that. Like we started to see things like Pose, we started to see things about like history becoming mainstream, so that like I don't know. So then I think that way younger filmmakers or newer, sorry, I shouldn't say younger, newer filmmakers who want to start telling these stories can just like start from where they want to start and like not have to like tell the whole story, like the whole history of like you know, their identities to the world. And I think
Yeah, I think you touched upon something that I am actually just picking up now that you mention it, is this idea of like a macro narrative, right? Versus a micro narrative, where this macro narrative is like, okay, I don't have to start from the beginning and tell this, like, okay, it's almost like this story is progressing. And I think in a lot of ways, and I mean, I personally think storytelling is a progression of culture, right? It's culture, it's passing down of culture, but then being able to again start from, okay, there is this queer couple, they're not coming out, they're you know, starting a family. It's almost like they're starting, it's like no longer the beginning of the story because the beginning has already been told, quote unquote. And so it kind of, you can start from, the story just starts. It doesn't need this kind of like a preamble to the story. So I really like that you mentioned that. Yeah. How about you, Sagan? What are you excited about in your various mediums, and like how storytelling is gonna maybe push the culture up a little bit in those areas?
Yeah, I think to Trisha's point about, you know, not having to start from zero, I think is super great, because I came out as trans pretty recently, also to myself. Like I was like, you know, deeply in the closet just 2019, so only a couple years ago. And but there's already like, you know, these amazing trans masculine artists out there who like Andy Stevenson, who are like putting stuff out there that I can, you know, see myself in a way that I always had to kind of abstract behind. You know, the story isn't about me, it's about a robot who just happens to want to change their body in various ways to do a thing. It's like that's not personal at all. So I think what I have to get used to now is being seen more. Like I'm really not, it almost makes me uncomfortable to like see stories that are a little too close to home. Or like, yeah, Detransition Baby was a novel that came out recently about trans women in New York, and a lot of people were like, you know, don't let the cis people see this. This is like secret stuff. Like you're spilling the beans. And I think sooner or later maybe everyone has to go through that. But I think it's for the best. It's gonna happen one way or another as we keep pushing for more representation. And I say this as someone who, like, you know, doesn't try to necessarily have an agenda, or like, again, the kind of stories I like, you know, even from queer people or someone from a marginalized background, are the ones that, you know, where they're not trying to appeal even to other, like, you know, the queer community is huge. They're not trying to appeal to like everyone in it. They're trying to, you know, satisfy some something within themselves. And that's kind of how I approach it. But by doing that, you naturally will produce something that, you know, someone else who's going through a similar thing will recognize and be touched by or moved by. And the other thing I wanted to sort of touch on in terms of missing media that I feel like is missing, when I was an executive director, I was doing a lot of curatorial work and a lot of programming work. And so I saw firsthand how big the gap can sometimes be between the work and the general public actually being able to access it or being interested or curious about it. And you really had to sometimes create an environment where they felt safe enough to explore beyond their comfort levels, because, you know, some people just like were really scared about crossing over into this land of things they don't know about. And so I think, you know, cultural intermediaries such as curators and film festivals and platforms who can bridge that gap and connect the stories to the right audience are super important. Because I found out that, like, you know, everyone is always like, oh, video games are all just about guys in space shooting each other. And it's like, actually, no, there's hundreds and thousands of games now that are not about that, but like, why isn't anyone hearing about them? Or like, why aren't we putting in more of the effort to seek these titles out and actually play them? So yeah, I think it's super important to have events like this and panels like this where you can connect people to the stories that are already out there and are being told.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there is sometimes that disconnect between the stories that people might want to or need to hear and the actual people themselves. Curious, I know we're just kind of wrapping up our last question here. Curious for the panel, like, do you think your respective storytelling mediums will evolve and change in the years to come? If so, how? And or like, do you hope it will some way in somehow?
I don't know, I just went, but does someone else want to?
Because
Because I was excited by the question, because yeah, video games are such a such a weird medium. So like, in terms of how storytelling will evolve, like I think we already kind of have gone through a shift in what the word story can mean or what narratives can be, because we kind of went through a phase where interactivity and participatory narratives were all the rage, like video games and VR and that sort of thing was very sexy. So instead of someone experiencing something in a linear fashion, they were given the illusion of control or an added sense of immersion. But then I've always been interested in how the internet like added even yet another dimension of complexity to this, where you have these parasocial dynamics between audience and artist that are really mediated by these highly commercial and algorithmically determined content creation platforms. So you have these like bizarre multimedia projects like Homestuck, where you have the story, but then you have this meta narrative of how one is able to create a community, or in some cases a runaway cult around the original intellectual property. So stuff like Dwarf Fortress or Twitch Plays Pokemon or Blazeball, they're not stories as we traditionally know them. They almost become storytelling machines, and I like to think of them more like they're not the stories themselves. They're like a campfire that draws people to its light and its warmth, and then the people themselves tell the stories. So all this fandom stuff and lore is generated from these experiences that people have, and then you have like another sub layer of like amateur preservationists or community preservationists, that where you kind of get like an oral storytelling thing going on, where it's like, oh, that thing that happened in that MMO, that like that one person died in real life, so that one famous player died in real life, so we all held an in-game funeral for them and like sent their body off in a virtual spaceship kind of a thing, and they pass these stories down in a almost like a very old-fashioned kind of way, even though the medium is very high tech. So all of that is like super fascinating to me, and it's almost kind of cyclical in a comforting way, that no matter how strange and heavily commercialized the internet becomes, there is that kind of sense we're all just sitting around a campfire telling stuff to each other, and that will happen probably even in the post-nuclear apocalypse. As long as there's at least 2 people surviving.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a question. There's always like a lot of predictions about that. I mean, I think it's probably inevitable that I think people like having a somewhat passive experience because it is a kind of escape this thing, but the way we experience, let's say, filmed content will eventually evolve, and the miniaturization will take place, that sort of the metaverse will eventually sort of engulf everything, including 2D content in some fashion that's at a more sophisticated version of that than exists now. I think the other major trend that is kind of unstoppable is the convergence between gaming and so real time and pre-recorded content. Like the gap between those two things is shrinking radically. And so if you look at just in the past 2 years, real-time technology was used to create The Mandalorian, right? All of the Mandalorian was almost entirely shot on a stage. But since then, and this was accelerated by the pandemic, like you've got entire, period shows now using that technology. So I think that's going to continue, and I think you're going to see, location shootings is going to drastically be reduced because of that, because it's much more cost efficient to, film like a period show. For instance, Cary Fukunaga's next project, it's a big World War II epic. It's filmed entirely on a stage, with LED screens and, real time using gaming technology, right? Which has been appropriated now to filmmaking, and in many ways for the filmmaker, it's better than working with fully animated environments and CG environments, and not really being able to experience what you're connecting with, in a practical sense. So I think that'll have like a follow-on impact into how we experience stories, I think. But I think that's a ways away. But I imagine, for instance, like there's going to be like I don't think my children who are 5 and 3 are driving is going to be like having a record player. You know what I mean? People will do it, but everybody's going to be in self-driving cars, and then the car is going to be the living room, right, of the future. So I think again that'll affect the content in some way. I could be wrong, of course. I'm not a futurist, but this is what this is just my ideas.
Yeah, I think that's all super. Sorry, there's like some background, some fun facts being dropped in the chat here about how the convergence of video games and filmmaking is like getting closer and closer, especially with technology buying out animation companies like Weta. But I think where I like to watch change in medium is like the democratization of tools, of the technique and things like that. And I think as that's happening on bigger scale, there's also things like the whole like meta thing, where like like VR has died and come back, but it's because it hasn't been able to be made accessible and things like that. So I'm not sure what that says for the future, but I do know, like, as I was from my post side, when camera formats started getting more digital, there was a shift in, I know that there's an argument that there's an environmental shift in like the way film was being processed, or like, but then also the there's shortage in like chips being made and sensors and things like that. So I'm not sure, but and then like when SLRs became digital and video capabilities and editing and color grading systems became free, like everyone's like vloggers and content creators came up. So it's like, I think there's always going to be a need for something on the screen. Like I think a friend was describing a VR experience they had where they literally sat in a movie theater in VR, and it was just sort of, they were just watching a movie in a theater but through their goggles. So it's always, I don't know, I feel like there's going to be a huge battle between the high production level of it, but then there's always going to be this sort of democratization, but also like demonetization, I guess. Like it's going to be harder, I don't know, to put value, I think, to work. I think that that's another way to think about the future of it. But
Yeah.
that's it.
I think you really hit the nail on the head with that, because I'm sitting here and I'm like, I make videos. I don't make films, but I tell stories through video on YouTube. Probably nowhere near as professional as any of you, but it's part of what I do, right? And so it's like very similar to, but again, this democracy where it's no longer needing a film studio. I can film, edit, and produce a video and post and share with, potentially millions across the world on a platform that takes up zero real estate and needs really no startup costs at all. So I really love to see how the different forms of storytelling are evolving through traditional mediums, but also just new mediums and new ways of telling stories. I know TikTok is a controversial place and a controversial app with lots of things, but I think just with new media and new apps coming up, just how people are able to use those tools to tell stories in different ways has been really interesting to me. So yeah, thank you so much. We are just about to close out our talk right now. I just want to thank Real Asian Film Festival for allowing us the space to share our stories. I think it's really important to get, folks from different backgrounds together to tell these stories so that we can, kind of impress upon everyone else, but also give everyone a place to feel, either seen or that there is a relation there. So thank you to all of you today for sharing, Trisha, Samir, and Sagan, and thank you for having me. I'll throw it back to you, Samir.
Hey, thank you so much for this chat. I loved it. It was such an amazing masterclass on storytelling. I can't wait to rewatch it. So Han, I really want to thank you for directing this wonderful conversation. We hope to continue the conversation on our film forum on Discord. And if you aren't on Discord yet, we would love for you to join. We dropped a link into the chat and we'll have the QR code posted up in a moment as well. Please scan the QR code for our survey too and let us know your thoughts. Again, thank you so much, Han, Samir, Sagan, and Trisha for today's convo. Thank you to Jamie and Joanne, our amazing ASL interpreters. And thank you to Marianne, our awesome live captioner. And for our backend support, thank you, Jasmine, Mimi, and Joe. Just a reminder that Real Asian is still going on until November 19th. You can learn more about our programming and how to buy a ticket at realasian.com/festival. Thank you for joining us today. We hope you take care, and we hope to see you tomorrow in another one of our panels. Bye, everyone.